Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can, wrote Virginia Reed, a young survivor of the Donner Party. Her words became a warning etched in memory, learned only after devastating loss. Tonight, we will walk slowly through the choices these families made, using the words they left behind. Their letters and diaries still carry the weight of hope, risk, and consequences that could not be undone. To understand their ordeal, we must first step back to the beginning, to the dream that drew them west, and the promise that seemed worth everything. What exactly made California so magnetic in 1846, a place worth leaving behind everything familiar? Imagine unfolding a newspaper and seeing bold promises of land for the taking. Imagine an invitation that claimed you could start again in a climate of endless harvests. For families like the Donners and the Reeds, California was not just a destination. It was a vision of a future that felt almost within reach. Guidebooks urged readers to picture California as a kind of second Eden. They spoke of fertile soil, abundant water, and air so mild that crops grew with little effort. If you were struggling with stony fields back east, these words would feel like hope in print. You might begin to make a quiet calculation. Could you sell your farm, trade your goods, and gather what mattered most for a journey that promised renewal? Families did exactly that. They sold their homes, auctioned tools, and packed wagons with the pieces of life they could not abandon. Alongside barrels of flour and bacon, they carried a family Bible, a child's doll tucked into a small box, and tools needed to build new shelter. These were not just supplies. They were symbols. They represented faith, memory, and the labor of tomorrow. Packing them was both a ritual of farewell and a pledge that life could begin again out west. Underneath these personal motives was a larger belief, shaping the nation, manifest destiny, the conviction that America was meant to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. When families looked at maps in the 1840s, much of the western landscape appeared as vague outlines, labeled with broad strokes like unexplored. Yet to immigrants, crossing those blank spaces was not just possible. It felt ordained. Ordinary farmers, tradesmen, and mothers with small children saw themselves as part of something larger than their own households. To move west was to fulfill both private dreams and a shared national story. And still, the practical realities pressed close. The journey loomed as thousands of miles of rough ground stretching across rivers, mountains, and deserts. Families knew letters sent back east might take months to arrive, if they came at all. Traveling west might mean never seeing older parents or siblings again. Yet the promise outweighed the absence. To stand at risk of separation was a price weighed against the hope that sons and daughters would inherit fields of their own. So when advertisements appeared, calling out with confidence, "Who wants to go to California without costing them anything?" the choice seemed almost clear. Possibility was worth the gamble. The Donners, the Reeds, and dozens of other households believed opportunity would greet them the moment they set down roots in California soil. They envisioned streets laid out, homes rising, and communities guided by their own work and values. This dream was powerful enough to send wagon after wagon rolling toward the unknown in the spring of 1846. Hope supplied the courage, and faith in the new land steadied the choice. What came next was no longer about reading promises on paper, but about acting on them. Families stood together, possessions packed, animals yoked. And with the dream of California clear in their minds, the question shifted quietly. How could anyone truly prepare for such a journey into the unknown? At Independence, Missouri, preparation became the first great test. Families crowded the jumping-off point, gathering in restless anticipation as wagons were repaired, goods inspected, and final choices made. These were not just private households moving west, but groups forming into shared companies with written constitutions to settle disputes, set rules for camping, and decide how to care for the sick or grieving. Strangers became companions because survival depended on it. The Donner and Reed families stood out in the crowd for their wealth and confidence. The Reeds' wagon was so large and outfitted, the travelers nicknamed it a pioneer palace. It had room for bunks, cushioned seats, and even an iron stove, a luxury unthinkable for most. Their entourage of servants and hired teamsters revealed how much they trusted that careful planning and lavish outfitting could blunt the hardships ahead. Yet even for ordinary families, the financial burden was immense. Contemporary estimates suggest that outfitting a single wagon could cost between $1,200 and $1,500, roughly 2 years' wages for some. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime bet. Unscrupulous traders sometimes convinced travelers to buy more than was necessary, overloading wagons until animals strained and immigrants were forced to discard prized belongings by the roadside. It was a humbling reminder that preparation, no matter how thorough, carried both hope and risk. What would you have packed? Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, baking soda, bacon, beans. and dried fruit were staples, with a Dutch oven and water keg essential for survival. Some families tied milk cows to their wagons, their slow walk yielding fresh milk each day, while the constant rocking of the journey churned cream into butter. Each item had to earn its place, and each decision asked you to weigh what was sustaining against what was sentimental. Animals were another crucial choice, and you would have had to decide how many oxen you could afford. Oxen were praised for patience and endurance, pulling steadily about 15 miles in a day. By contrast, mules could move faster but were less reliable under strain. The choice revealed more than preference. It determined the rhythm of each day and the limits of what might be endured. In the rush before departure, excitement mixed with uncertainty. Tamsin Donna wrote, "I can give you no idea of the hurry of this place at this time, recalling the crowded streets, the clatter of wagons, and the smell of livestock. But amid the energy, a few experienced voices urged caution. Mountain man James Kleiman warned James Reed not to take untested routes, advising him to stay to the regular wagon track. His words were urgent. The trail was barely passable even when followed faithfully. Guidebooks, though, offered more encouraging visions. Lansford Hastings' widely read Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California laid out grazing grounds, water sources, and landmarks, assuring readers that steady progress would lead them to success. These optimistic words often drowned out the harsher notes of warning. By the time the Donners, Reeds, and nearly 50 other families ready to roll westward, the pieces were in place, wagons assembled, groups organized, supplies loaded, dreams intact. The work of preparation gave way to the march itself, and soon routine would take over as the wagons moved at the patient, steady pace of their animals, and the first full days on the trail began to unfold. What exactly made California so magnetic in 1846, a place worth leaving behind everything familiar? Imagine unfolding a newspaper and seeing bold promises of land for the taking. Imagine an invitation that claimed you could start again in a climate of endless harvests. For families like the Donners and the Reeds, California was not just a destination. It was a vision of a future that felt almost within reach. Guidebooks urged readers to picture California as a kind of second Eden. They spoke of fertile soil, abundant water, and air so mild that crops grew with little effort. If you were struggling with stony fields back east, these words would feel like hope in print. You might begin to make a quiet calculation. Could you sell your farm, trade your goods, and gather what mattered most for a journey that promised renewal? Families did exactly that. They sold their homes, auctioned tools, and packed wagons with the pieces of life they could not abandon. Alongside barrels of flour and bacon, they carried a family Bible, a child's doll tucked into a small box, and tools needed to build new shelter. These were not just supplies. They were symbols. They represented faith, memory, and the labor of tomorrow. Packing them was both a ritual of farewell and a pledge that life could begin again out west. Underneath these personal motives was a larger belief, shaping the nation, manifest destiny, the conviction that America was meant to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. When families looked at maps in the 1840s, much of the western landscape appeared as vague outlines, labeled with broad strokes like unexplored. Yet to emigrants, crossing those blank spaces was not just possible. It felt ordained. Ordinary farmers, tradesmen, and mothers with small children saw themselves as part of something larger than their own households. To move west was to fulfill both private dreams and a shared national story. And still, the practical realities pressed close. The journey loomed as thousands of miles of rough ground stretching across rivers, mountains, and deserts. Families knew letters sent back east might take months to arrive, if they came at all. Traveling west might mean never seeing older parents or siblings again. Yet the promise outweighed the absence. To stand at risk of separation was a price weighed against the hope that sons and daughters would inherit fields of their own. So when advertisements appeared, calling out with confidence, "Who wants to go to California without costing them anything?" the choice seemed almost clear. Possibility was worth the gamble. The Donners, the Reeds, and dozens of other households believed opportunity would greet them the moment they set down roots in California soil. They envisioned streets laid out, homes rising, and communities guided by their own work and values. This dream was powerful enough to send wagon after wagon rolling toward the unknown in the spring of 1846. Hope supplied the courage, and faith in the new land steadied the choice. What came next was no longer about reading promises on paper, but about acting on them. Families stood together, possessions packed, animals yoked. And with the dream of California clear in their minds, the question shifted quietly. How could anyone truly prepare for such a journey into the unknown? At Independence, Missouri, preparation became the first great test. Families crowded the jumping-off point, gathering in restless anticipation as wagons were repaired, goods inspected, and final choices made. These were not just private households moving west, but groups forming into shared companies with written constitutions to settle disputes, set rules for camping, and decide how to care for the sick or grieving. Strangers became companions because survival depended on it. The Donner and Reed families stood out in the crowd for their wealth and confidence. The Reed's wagon was so large and outfitted, the travelers nicknamed it a pioneer palace. It had room for bunks, cushioned seats, and even an iron stove, a luxury unthinkable for most. Their entourage of servants and hired teamsters revealed how much they trusted that careful planning and lavish outfitting could blunt the hardships ahead. Yet even for ordinary families, the financial burden was immense. Contemporary estimates suggest that outfitting a single wagon could cost between $1,200 and $1,500, roughly 2 years' wages for some. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime bet. Unscrupulous traders sometimes convinced travelers to buy more than was necessary, overloading wagons until animals strained and immigrants were forced to discard prized belongings by the roadside. It was a humbling reminder that preparation, no matter how thorough, carried both hope and risk. What would you have packed? Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, tea, baking soda, bacon, beans, and dried fruit were staples, with a Dutch oven and water keg essential for survival. Some families tied milk cows to their wagons, their slow walk yielding fresh milk each day, while the constant rocking of the journey churned cream into butter. Each item had to earn its place, and each decision asked you to weigh what was sustaining against what was sentimental. Animals were another crucial choice, and you would have had to decide how many oxen you could afford. Oxen were praised for patience and endurance, pulling steadily about 15 miles in a day. By contrast, mules could move faster but were less reliable under strain. The choice revealed more than preference. It determined the rhythm of each day and the limits of what might be endured. In the rush before departure, excitement mixed with uncertainty. Tamsin Donner wrote, "I can give you no idea of the hurry of this place at this time, recalling the crowded streets, the clatter of wagons, and the smell of livestock." But amid the energy, a few experienced voices urged caution. Mountain man James Kleiman warned James Reed not to take untested routes, advising him to stay to the regular wagon track. His words were urgent. The trail was barely passable even when followed faithfully. Guidebooks, though, offered more encouraging visions. Lansford Hastings' widely read Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California laid out grazing grounds, water sources, and landmarks, assuring readers that steady progress would lead them to success. These optimistic words often drowned out the harsher notes of warning. By the time the Donners, Reeds, and nearly 50 other families ready to roll westward, the pieces were in place, wagons assembled, groups organized, supplies loaded, dreams intact. The work of preparation gave way to the march itself, and soon routine would take over as the wagons moved at the patient, steady pace of their animals, and the first full days on the trail began to unfold. The rhythm of trail life was steady and unrelenting, shaping every hour of the journey. You rose before dawn, stirred from sleep by a bugle blast or the crack of a gunshot that split the quiet air. At 4 in the morning, the camp shook itself awake. By 5, men gathered the cattle that had grazed during the night, while women and older children crouched by small fires, coaxing flames into breakfast, bacon sizzling in pans, corn mush thickening slowly, flour and water cakes cooking over the coals. The smell was simple but filling, the kind of food meant to carry you into another long day. As soon as the meal passed, routines flowed in practiced steps. You and your family rinsed the tin plates, folded bedding, and stowed away the few comforts of rest. Men hitched teams, tightening harness straps and tapping wheels to be sure nothing would break in the miles ahead. Then, just as the sun reached low across the plains, a trumpet sounded at 7. Wagons ho. The line creaked into motion, oxen straining at the yokes, wheels groaning, and dust rising in a veil that clung to clothing and settled in every fold of the skin. The pace was slow but constant, 2 miles an hour at best. 15 miles in a day counted as progress, and 20 meant a rare reward. You walked beside the wagons, most of the time on your feet, rather than riding, shoes scuffed thin from stone and grit. Men rode ahead on horseback, scouting bad ground or clearing branches from the trail. At noon, the wagons pulled to a stop. Everyone sat in the pale shade of canvas or scrub trees, sharing a cold meal of bread or meat, resting feet and shoulders before setting off again at 1. The pause was brief, but it marked the day, like a heartbeat in a body always moving. Sometime around 5, the day's travel ended. The search was for water and grass, always the same demands to satisfy the wagons and the animals. Once a place was chosen, the wagons pulled into a circle, forming a rough corral. This shape offered both shelter and a pen for the livestock. Night routines began. Women cooked supper, mended clothes, and settled small children. Men tended animals, checked axles, and handled repairs by firelight. Their work slid into conversation, pipe smoke curling into the twilight. Younger travelers might laugh, play music, or dance on the hard earth until shadows grew long. For some, the circle of wagons, glowing fires and voices in the dusk almost felt like a village on the move. Meals brought both the expected and the unexpected. The wagons carried flour, beans, salt pork, and bacon. But immigrants added to this whenever they could. A deer or buffalo from the plains, a scatter of wild berries, or milk from the cows tied behind the wagons offered small moments of variety. Churn shifted against the jolting wheels, butter forming by accident even as dust continued to coat everything. By nightfall, prayers or quiet stories closed the day. Families settled into tents or wagons, the sounds of animals and the watchful footsteps of guards replacing the noise of motion. In this cycle, waking, walking, resting, circling together, daily life on the trail found its own order. The sameness comforted, even as every mile pushed farther into unfamiliar ground. But routines could not protect against decisions waiting ahead. The pattern of trail life moved steadily west, until one choice appeared that would tempt them with promises of saving time. The lure of Hastings Cutoff arose from the ambitions of a young lawyer with very little frontier experience. Lansford Hastings was only 27, but he was determined to shape the settlement of the Far West. In 1845, he published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California *, a slim book that promised clear directions, fertile land, and a faster way west. He wrote with great confidence about a shortcut through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Yet Hastings had never led a single wagon over this route. His words were persuasive on the page, but his experience did not match his claims. For families already weary from weeks on the trail, the promise of saving 350 to 400 miles sounded like a gift. Hastings persuaded them that a straighter line across the map meant easier travel. He assured them that the land ahead was rich with water and grass, downplaying the harsh ground and scarcity of resources. To immigrants who measured each step by the fading season, this suggestion of save time was hard to resist. At the junction where the decision had to be made, the Donner and Reed families studied Hastings' descriptions. James Reed carried a copy of the guidebook in his hands. He saw the arguments laid out straightforwardly. Quicker passage, less chance of snow in the Sierra, sooner access to prime land in California. Imagine being in his place. You would have considered the families walking at your side and the wagons grinding forward each day. You might hope that an untested route would carry you ahead of the crowded trail. Some voices urged caution. Mountain man James Kleiman, who had just ridden the country Hastings praised, warned Reed not to gamble with wagons on those slopes and wastes. He knew firsthand how rough the Wasatch terrain became and how hostile the desert would be. But set against him was the tidy authority of a published book. Who would you trust? A dusty rider with worry in his voice, or a guidebook that promised safety in print? The emigrants leaned toward the page. Their desire for speed outweighed their doubts. Behind Hastings' confident words was more than optimism. He envisioned California, then still under Mexican rule, filling with American settlers. He hoped such a flood of immigrants would reshape the region and perhaps even allow him a role in its leadership. Promoting a bold cutoff route was part of that plan. If his shortcut succeeded, his reputation would rise along with the number of Americans eager to claim land in the West. To him, the risk looked less like fraud and more like strategy. For the families on the trail, none of this wider ambition mattered. They saw a choice between two paths, one proven but long, the other promising advantage if luck held. Choosing the shorter line seemed to tilt the balance of their hopes. It was a leap between caution and ambition, weighed out against the shortening days of summer. When they turned toward the cutoff, they were also looking toward Hastings himself, imagining he would be there to guide them through. What they encountered instead was something very different. At Fort Bridger, the emigrants expected certainty, but instead found uncertainty sharpened. This small trading post, built only a few years earlier by Jim Bridger and Louis Vasquez, was the last major settlement before entering the Great Basin. It offered tools, food, and the chance to rest oxen before the hardest ground yet. For travelers, it felt like standing on the edge of the known world, gathering strength before stepping into the blank spaces of the map. The Donner and Reed families arrived on July 27, 1846, fully expecting to meet Lansford Hastings in person. His book had promised not only a shorter route, but also his physical guidance. Instead, the emigrants discovered he had already moved ahead, leaving only written notes for those who intended to follow. The disappointment was real. Where they had hoped for a steady voice and a leader, they found only pages and second-hand instructions. Still, guidance came from others. Fort Bridger's traders reassured the company that Hastings' route was good land for wagons. They described it as open country with water and grass in abundance. To tired families measuring every risk against the promise of California, these assurances carried real weight. James Reed, focused on the possibility of saving hundreds of miles, found this especially persuasive. And yet, another voice echoed differently. James Kleiman, who had recently scouted the region, had already warned Reed that wagons might not endure the rough canyons and harsh desert ahead. His words stood in stark contrast. Reed held Hastings' written directions, Bridger offered promises, and Kleiman gave a grim warning. The choice did not arrive as an abstract dilemma. It came in real exchanges, where one man nodded with confidence and another refused to soften the truth. At Fort Bridger, the group paused. They weighed the known Oregon Trail, long but steady, against the gamble of Hastings' Cutoff. To retreat felt almost impossible. Months of travel separated them from Missouri, and turning back would mean admitting failure. To continue on the established path meant a slower pace, perhaps even risking snow in the Sierra. The shortcut, if it worked, promised earlier arrival and new ground waiting to be claimed. For 4 days, the company rested. Oxen grazed, wagons were tightened, and families leaned on conversations to frame their path. Children played within the circle of wagons, while their parents considered how to measure one man's warnings against another's encouragements. In those days of hesitation, optimism gained ground over doubt. The picture drawn by Hastings and reinforced by Bridger's assurances seemed brighter than Kleiman's dark forecast. On July 31st, they set their decision in motion. They packed the last of their supplies, tied up the teams, and moved forward not with Hastings at their side, but with his notes in their hands. This was the point of no return. Behind them lay the relative safety of the main trail. Ahead stretched a line no wagon train had yet proven. What waited was not the smooth road they had been promised. It was terrain that would demand strength, tools, and time in ways no one at Fort Bridger could yet imagine. How did the supposed shortcut turn into an ordeal? As soon as the wagons entered the Wasatch Mountains, the emigrants discovered that no road existed. Instead of a passable trail, tangled undergrowth and narrow canyons blocked their way. The only choice was to cut through. Men took up axes, working from dawn to dusk to hack a path wide enough for the wagons. Trees crashed down, brush was piled aside, and boulders had to be pried from the soil. Each wagon's passage was earned through hours of labor, every foot of progress claimed by sweat. The slow pace was crushing. What had been advertised as a shortcut became a crawl of barely 1 to 2 miles a day. At Big Mountain, it took 6 full days to clear only 8 miles. The wagons jolted forward for a short stretch, only to halt again for more chopping, hauling, and repairs. For those traveling on foot, it must have felt as if the landscape swallowed each day whole, giving back almost nothing in return. These delays brought immediate consequences. Provisions disappeared at a faster rate than any guidebook had warned. Families chewed through flour, beans, bacon, and coffee while advancing less distance each day. Oxen, straining on steep slopes with fewer places to graze, grew weaker. Their ribs showed plainly, and their steady pull slowed. Every day spent in the Wasatch was a day lost to the approaching autumn, a season already whispering of the cold passes still ahead. The work itself wore at the community. Men unused to swinging an axe developed blisters and raw hands. Tempers frayed as some carried more of the labor than others. What began as cooperation at Fort Bridger strained under exhaustion here. Even children felt the weight, gathering firewood at dusk or stumbling beside wagons over uneven ground long after they should have rested. With each delay, voices rose and patience thinned. Wagons broke frequently on the rugged rocks, splitting axles or snapping tongues. Repairs demanded still more time, and while groups stopped to fix them, others waited, restless and anxious. The rhythm of movement, so steady on the main trail, was gone. Instead, the company lurched forward in halts and starts, progress measured in fragments of miles. It was a harsh reminder that maps and promises did not make ground passable. Only backbreaking work could do that. The land itself remained uncompromising. Canyons twisted sharply, threatening wagons with narrow turns where one slip could mean a fall. Thick stands of timber blocked the light. Water sources proved uncertain. Sometimes they stumbled across a stream. Other times they wandered for hours before finding enough for both people and animals. At night, families collapsed into camp, shoulders aching, facing the knowledge that the very next morning the cycle would begin again. And always there was the gnawing awareness of time. Every mile carved from the Wasatch came at a cost in food, energy, and morale. Each halt made the threat of winter crossing the Sierra more real. What had been imagined as a smooth shortcut now revealed itself as an unforeseen trap, quietly binding them to weeks of struggle. When at last they staggered clear of the mountain canyons, weary and diminished, they hoped the worst was behind them. But the path ahead stretched into a different kind of trial, one where the mountains gave way to a vast, white plain that seemed to have no end. What met the emigrants now was the Great Salt Lake Desert, an 80-mile stretch that stripped away whatever strength the Wasatch still allowed them. From a distance, the flat expanse looked smooth and hard, like a pale road leading forward. Up close, the crust gave way beneath wagon wheels, cracking and sucking at iron rims until every jolt slowed progress. Walking across, it felt like stepping onto the lid of an empty world. The heat deepened the trial. By day, the sun pressed down without mercy, baking the salt until the ground itself seemed to shimmer. Moisture hidden under the crust boiled upward, turning the surface into sticky mud that clung to hooves and wheels. There was no tree for shade, no breeze to soften the glare. Journals speak of thirst so sharp that travelers believed they saw water pools on the horizon, only for the mirages to break apart as they moved closer. Each mirage reforged their hunger for relief, then crushed it again. Water, more than anything, decided their pace. Hastings had promised this crossing would take just 2 days. In reality, it stretched to 6. Supplies in barrels and kegs dwindled fast, even before the halfway mark, and what little may have been found on the ground was undrinkable. People staggered under the weight of dehydration. Children cried until their voices grew hoarse, unable to stop. The animals bore the worst of it. Oxen sagged into the crust, knees folding beneath ribs that showed more clearly with each day of strain. Dozens were lost outright, left where they fell, unfit to carry a wagon another mile. Contemporary accounts speak of as many as 30 to 40 animals perishing. Each fallen team not only robbed families of transport, but also forced them into another grim duty, leaving wagons, furniture, or tools behind in long trails across the desert floor. You might imagine the path littered with the marks of hope surrendered, a crib, a chest, a stove gleaming in the salt. Every family had to decide what could be discarded and what must remain. Heavy trunks that once held keepsakes were flung open, clothes scattered. Some items of great meaning never moved beyond the flats. It was more than loss of possessions. It marked a slow recognition that survival demanded stripping away nearly everything they had thought essential. The longer it lasted, the more the desert bent them. The trail of abandoned oxen, wagons, and supplies was also a trail of spirit pressed thin. What had begun as optimism hardened into silence. At night, thirsty and worn, families sank onto the salt, trying to sleep within air that still radiated the heat of the day. Morning meant standing up and beginning again, feet burning, eyes stung by the white glare, shoulders bowed against another day with no shade. When at last they staggered from the desert's edge, they came out lightened but wounded. Their animals were fewer, their wagons stripped, their people shaken. What Hastings promised us 2 days instead took 6, and the cost was measured in lost lives of cattle, in goods cast off, and in hope reduced to embers. The shortcut had not only failed them, it had stolen time, resources, and strength that could never be regained. Emerging from that white expanse, they faced the land ahead with new eyes. Supplies had run low, tempers had shortened, and the full weight of delay pressed close. This was the moment when survival would depend less on promises of shortcuts and more on how they managed what remained. The days after leaving the desert brought a sharper awareness of limits. Supplies ran thin, not just for one family but across the company as a whole. Provisions meant to last months had been eaten away early, leaving them with flour barrels almost empty and salted meat already scarce. Delays from the Hastings Cutoff had consumed their margin of safety, and now the journey west felt less like migration and more like survival. With animals trampled and provisions shrinking, the window to cross the Sierra narrowed. Many oxen had collapsed in the desert heat, and those that survived staggered under the demands of heavy loads. Every loss reduced what could be carried forward. Families had to cast off cherished belongings, trunks of clothes, heirlooms, things that once tied them to the homes they had abandoned in Missouri. The trail behind became dotted with reminders of lives slowly shed. Each mile forward weighed heavily because the season itself pressed down on them. The year moved later, and with autumn came a new dread, that the Sierra Nevada might soon be locked in snow. The emigrants had always known the passes could close early, but the thought now felt immediate. They sensed the mountain barrier waiting to test what remained of their strength. As rations tightened, so did tempers. Morale broke in visible ways. Grumbling rose around evening fires, and decisions once made collectively now sparked debate. Should food be divided evenly, or should families manage their own? Who bore responsibility for the delays that threatened them all? The unity felt at Independence and Fort Bridger frayed in the strain. Families began guarding their supplies, wary that sharing now might leave them hungry later. Arguments reached past food. Which direction should they take? How long should they rest? Whether it was wiser to push or conserve energy. All became points of contention. Every answer carried the shadow of loss. The strain revealed itself in quiet tears, sharp words, and a deepening reluctance to trust. You might imagine the silence sitting heavy at night, each fire circle closing in more tightly. Still, they searched for ways to stretch what little they had. Hunting parties went out armed with rifles, hoping to find buffalo, deer, or smaller game. Their returns were slim. In barren stretches, even rabbits proved scarce. Fresh calories offered momentary relief, but there was no lasting answer in luck. Water, too, grew less certain. Sometimes they detoured miles out of their path to fill barrels, each diversion taking food and strength they could not afford to lose. Desperation slowly entered their routines. Patrick Breen later wrote of families boiling hides to eat when nothing else remained, a detail that shows the quiet extremes of their decline. Editor's note: his diary offers a powerful source for a brief read aloud, giving listeners the intimacy of hearing one emigrant's own words. What once had been a shared venture turned into a daily calculation of endurance. By the time the weakened train reached the edge of the Sierra, supplies and patience had both worn thin. Each wagon, each family, carried less food and more fear. The journey was no longer about reaching California with plenty, but about making it to the far side of the mountains at all. And now, for the first time, they had to face the narrowing choice laid out before them by the rising Sierra. When the immigrants reached the Sierra Nevada, the question became whether the journey could be finished before winter closed the way. Snow had already begun falling in late October, earlier and heavier than anyone expected. White ridges crowned the mountains, hinting at how quickly the passes might seal. They were still roughly 100 miles from Sutter's Fort, yet the last barrier now rose sharply in front of them. Imagine being 2 months into a months-long trip and realizing that winter may already have locked the only road between you and safety. At Truckee Lake, they faced a decision that could not be postponed. They could press on across the pass, knowing the snow might trap them mid-slope. Or they could wait, building time into their journey with hopes the storms would clear. Retracing their steps was not really an option. Both choices carried real risk. To push forward meant fatigue and possible entrapment. To wait meant sinking deeper into hunger with no certainty of relief. The emigrants were already at the edge of their endurance. The delays on the Hastings Cutoff and the desert crossing had cost them livestock, supplies, and strength. Families were weak from weeks of reduced meals and constant labor. Animals staggered beneath wagons that were stripped nearly bare. These conditions clouded judgment. In such exhaustion, the mind reaches for hope where reason might counsel caution. They chose to establish camp by the lake. This decision reflected not a simple miscalculation, but an attempt to manage risk with the limited information they had. Previous seasons in the mountains had not brought such early storms, so they underestimated how severe this winter could be. They believed that building shelter and waiting could allow them to preserve enough energy for the crossing once the weather broke. The choice was made less from confidence than from depletion. Within days, their decision began to harden into confinement. Blizzards swept across the high ridges, dropping heavy snow that buried the trail and erased landmarks. What might have been a clear path in summer became a blank, engulfing whiteness. Visibility fell, and even strong men could not break through drifts that rose deeper each day. To venture too high onto the trail risked not only fatigue but vanishing into the storm. The reality was grim. The storms of October and early November were not typical for that season. They blocked movement entirely, and the emigrants had to retreat from the slopes they had tried to climb. The lake became not just a campsite, but the center of a desperate pause where options closed in. What they judged to be a temporary wait became the beginning of prolonged entrapment. In this moment, the Hastings Cutoff revealed its full cost. The shortcut had delayed their arrival to the very edge of winter so that when early storms appeared, they had no time to recover or adapt. Geography and timing conspired, and their own exhaustion sealed the choice to remain where they were. Waiting through such storms meant finding a way to endure the mountain winter itself. With snow deepening and food already scarce, families turned to the only tools they carried and the land around them, trying to shape shelter from what little could be found. Faced with an early winter unlike anything they had expected, the emigrants tried to shape a camp where none existed. This marked the beginning of their attempt at winter shelter. At Truckee Lake, some families hastily built lean-tos and cabins, while others spread wagon canvas over log frames. A second cluster, including the Donners, established themselves miles back at Alder Creek. These two sites became their refuge, fragile outposts set against storms that showed no sign of easing. The Breen family managed to occupy an abandoned cabin near the lake, a small structure started earlier by other travelers. Its half-finished walls and roof spared them some work and gave better shelter than canvas alone. Other families had no such advantage. They cut logs from nearby stands of timber, dragging them into place by hand. Trees were left with their stumps cut a foot or more above ground, marks later remembered as signposts of how deep the snowdrifts had already become when they worked with axes raised above their shoulders. Where strength gave out, lighter shelters were attempted. Lean taws rose with rock walls or thick trunks as the back, their slanted roofs covered by whatever wood or hides could be found. Some dug shallow pits in the frozen ground, roofing them with branches and canvas, hoping to let the earth itself block the wind. In time, even ox hides salvaged from the dead animals were stretched over cabins as makeshift coverings. These roofs, sodden and foul-smelling, at least broke the snow's weight overhead. Each structure differed in quality, not because of choice, but because of what each family had left. Provisions dwindled, tools had broken, and energy grew thinner every day. The shelters they built bore that truth, some close to passable cabins, others closer to burrows. Together they stood scattered around the frozen lake and along the creek, their smoke rising thinly into the white stillness. Life inside was spare. Squares of canvas let in drafts, roofs leaked, and fires barely held back the chill. Families arranged themselves closely, lying in rows for warmth where space allowed. In the Breen cabin, damp walls pressed in on all sides. In the smaller dugouts, there was hardly room to stand upright. All the while, snow continued to bury the roofs and close the paths between one shelter and another. Still, the people tried to hold to patterns that gave meaning. They visited across the snow when they could. Children were comforted and fed first, even if it meant adults went hungry. Despite scarcity, people shared what little they had, trading scraps of food or space along a fire. These small acts of care were as essential to survival as the logs in the walls. The site later came to be remembered as Starvation Camp, a name that spoke to what conditions would demand from them. Routines of meals and prayer gave fragile structure, but both food and strength ebbed with each week. Snow piled deeper, sealing them in as choices narrowed. From these shelters, the emigrants faced a worsening truth. Protection from storms meant little without food. And in time, some among them would look outward, across the high ridges, wondering if help could still be reached. What followed was an attempt unlike any before in the party. 15 people agreed to leave the camp and try to reach California on foot. This group, later called the Forlorn Hope, set out on December 16, 1846. It included 9 men, 5 women, and a 12-year-old boy. They were charged with the terrible responsibility of finding help for more than 60 others still trapped in the snow. To even attempt the crossing, they needed to fight the snow itself. Using ox bows from their wagons and strips of rawhide, they built rough snowshoes. These crude frames spread their weight across the drifts, but offered little comfort. They carried what food they still had, but it was never enough. Though the effort was ingenious, it soon became plain that it could not protect them from the deep winter ahead. Snow lay in thick ridges across the mountains, sometimes higher than a person's chest. Each step through it drained strength, and progress slowed almost to a stop. Their clothing, already worn thin, bled in the cold. Fires at night gave little warmth. Rations dwindled within days, so quickly that the journey turned from mission into struggle. The will that carried them forward came less from the body than from the knowledge of who waited behind at camp. Without food, their bodies weakened sharply. Confusion spread as hunger pressed in. Some collapsed in the snow and never stood again. Others urged the group onward, aware that delay meant death for all. The pace slowed, and the effort of simply staying together became part of their fight. Of the 15 who marched out, only 7 finally lived to reach settlements on the far side and summon aid. Their surviving accounts, written later, describe having to eat the flesh of those who had died in order to continue. These words should be spoken quietly, because they reflect not spectacle, but the stark measure of desperation. Contemporary accounts also report that 2 native guides, Luis and Salvador, who had aided the group, were killed by some members. Historians debate the motives and details of this act, but it remains one of the hardest parts of the record to face. The Forlorn Hope March stands as a sign of what crisis can demand. It shows how determination can carry people past the point they thought possible, and how the border between endurance and collapse grows thin under cold and hunger. Their journey was not only a test of distance, but also of the limits of what people could bring themselves to do for survival. By the time the 7 survivors emerged into settlements, they were more thought than flesh, more memory than strength. Yet their arrival mattered. They were able to organize the first rescue for those still held in the camps. The story they lived invites us to look more closely at why survival came to some and not to others. In the frozen camps, differences appeared, not just of luck or strength, but of how people held together. Why did survival fall to some and not to others? In the winter camps, social bonds and family structures played a powerful role, shaping not only who endured, but how they endured. Anthropological analysis shows that men died at nearly twice the rate of women. This was not chance. Men's higher metabolic needs and the heavier labor often expected of them placed greater strain on bodies already weakened by hunger. Women, with lower caloric requirements and higher fat reserves, could survive longer on scant rations. Children, when sheltered in family groups, often received priority in food allocation. Age mattered as well. Younger adults often endured better than the very old or the very young, who were more vulnerable to cold and starvation. What choices would you make under that pressure? The size and strength of the family unit also shaped outcomes. Larger family groups could share resources, divide labor, and ease the burden of care. Their emotional closeness preserved morale, which mattered as much as physical shelter. The Breen family offers one clear example. 9 members, parents and children, stayed together and survived the winter relatively intact. The Reed family, too, managed to hold fast, their unity helping sustain them when food and warmth were scarce. By contrast, the Donners, separated at Alder Creek and weakened by illness, suffered grievous losses, illustrating the peril of fractured groups. For those without families, survival became harder. Solitary men or small clusters without strong ties often faced the snow with less support and greater despair. Isolation meant fewer hands to share the work of cutting wood, tending fires, or rationing food. In that loneliness, willpower faltered. Companionship could not replace meat or bread, but it held people through cold nights when despair might otherwise have ended their effort. You can imagine how even a single small act, sharing a portion, sitting close at a fire, could mean the difference between enduring the night or losing hope altogether. Community bonds extended beyond the family hearth. When shelter and provisions were pooled, when fairness governed distribution, groups wasted less energy on quarrels and guarded each other's strength. Cooperation slowed decline. Conversely, when bonds frayed, conflict drained energy already stretched to its edge. The winter underscored that survival was not a contest of individuals alone, but a fragile network of interdependence. Taken together, these patterns reveal a kind of natural selection shaped by circumstance. Sex, age, and family size determined risk, but so did the presence or absence of care. To say this is not to reduce lives to statistics, but to acknowledge how biology and community intersected in the snowbound camps. Both resilience of body and resilience of spirit mattered, each amplified or diminished by the ties people held with one another. In the mountains, survival meant more than weathering hunger and cold. It meant belonging to a circle of care. For the Breens and Reeds, that circle held. For others, it broke too soon. Once we see this, another question arises quietly in the background. Who else was present in those same mountains, watching these struggles unfold, and sometimes shaping their course? In those frozen mountains, the pioneers were not as alone as later stories sometimes suggest. The Washoe people, or Welmelty, had lived in this region for centuries, following seasonal cycles and storing food in lower valleys long before snow closed the high passes. From their vantage, the emigrants' camps at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek were set in the wrong place for that time of year, places unsuited for winter survival. Oral history and archaeology together show that Washoe families observed the strangers and, at first, tried to help. They left offerings of rabbit meat and wild roots near the edge of camp. In some cases, they attempted to trade and even brought a deer, though accounts suggest they were sometimes shot at or driven off by wary immigrants. What the pioneers experienced as unrelenting isolation was, in truth, more complicated. Aid was offered, yet it came with distance, shaped by caution on both sides. The reasons for this distance are not hard to guess. Language barriers meant clear communication was almost impossible. The immigrants themselves, in deep fear and hunger, may not have known how to trust people they barely understood. And the Washoe, upon seeing signs of cannibalism within the camps, grew frightened for their own safety. Their response was neither a full withdrawal nor simple rejection. Rather, they gave what help they could at the margins while keeping themselves at a safe remove. Archaeological studies at Alder Creek add another quiet layer. Among the broken dishes, glass, and cooking hearths left by the Donner Party, researchers also found indigenous stone tools, reminders that this land was not blank wilderness, but a lived-in landscape. These discoveries reveal how the immigrants' suffering unfolded in the midst of an older presence. The Washoe had passed here for generations, leaving traces of their work and memory. To imagine the Donner camps without recognizing this context risks telling only half the story. This perspective reminds us that the tragedy was not only a pioneer narrative of hardship, but also a story of encounter, however limited. The Washoe observed strangers who desperately needed help. They tried to leave food, they tested possibilities of contact, yet fear and cultural distance shaped the outcome. Their accounts, carried forward in oral tradition, tell of compassion on one side and caution on the other, both entirely human responses to what they saw in those cabins and shelters. For the emigrants, the presence of native people never became the lifeline it might have been. Seasonal knowledge of safe campsites, hidden food sources, and winter strategies lay close at hand, but the gulf of trust between the groups kept that wisdom largely out of reach. In this way, an opportunity for guidance slipped past, leaving the Donner Party dependent only on its own dwindling stores and strength. Seen with this broader view, the story becomes more than a tale of stranded wagons. It also reflects the tensions of westward expansion, in which indigenous communities watch their lands pressed by unexpected arrivals while weighing whether and how to respond. The Washou's caution added one more complexity to a winter already defined by scarcity and fear, and as the Washoe kept their distance, another force was beginning to stir far from the mountains. Word of the stranded families traveled outward, until it reached communities beyond the Sierra who faced their own decision, whether to risk the storms and attempt a rescue. Help did come, though slowly and at tremendous cost. In California's small settlements, word of the stranded emigrants drew volunteers together. People who had never met the pioneers felt compelled to act, even though it meant risking their own lives in the same storms that had already shut the passes. This was the beginning of the rescue effort, organized in the depth of winter when relief seemed almost impossible. Rescue parties began setting out in February 1847. The first group left determined to cut through deep snowdrifts and ice to reach the camps. They battled exposure, frostbite, and exhaustion as they advanced mile by mile. Each step was a gamble against the same terrain that had defeated the Donner Party just months earlier. Still, they pressed forward, knowing that hungry families desperately waited somewhere beyond the ridges. By mid-February, the rescuers broke through to Truckee Lake and Alder Creek. What they found shocked even seasoned frontiersmen. Survivors were skeletal, their clothes in tatters, their voices weak. Some had grown delirious from hunger and cold. Within the snowbound shelters, evidence of extreme measures to stay alive confronted the rescuers directly. It was a scene they would never forget. The first rescue group managed to escort about 24 people back across the mountains. Not everyone could travel at once. Many were too weak, and conditions were too severe. Families like the Breens remained behind to await the next attempt. This marked the beginning of a series of relief journeys. In total, 4 separate rescue parties crossed the Sierra between February and April, each battling storms, dangerous footing, and their own dwindling supplies. The work was relentless. Rescuers often had to break trail through snow shoulder deep, spending nights in open camps exposed to the same brutal wind as those they sought to save. Yet they returned again and again. Over 2 months, each new party carried more starving emigrants down to safety, though always leaving others behind to wait. Along the way, small acts of heroism stood out. One man, John Stark, became remembered for his extraordinary resolve. When his group of survivors faltered, he carried children 2 at a time across the snow, setting them down before returning for the next. Step by step, he refused to leave anyone behind. Stories like this gave the rescues a human face, reminders of how far people would go to preserve life. Despite all these efforts, not everyone could be reached in time. The toll was stark. Of the 87 who had set out for California the year before, only about half, roughly 46 to 47 depending on the record, survived. The rest perished in the mountains. Numbers vary slightly, but the meaning is clear. Hope came too late for many. By April, the final expedition arrived, rescuing the last survivor, Louis Kesselberg. He was found gaunt, half-mad, and alone among the bodies of his companions. With his removal, the long ordeal in the Sierra at last came to an end, though the ordeal in memory was only beginning. The story of rescue was about more than endurance. It laid bare the resilience of communities, the bravery of volunteers, and the undeniable limits of help delayed. For those who lived to stand once more on California soil, survival itself was only the start of what lay ahead. In the months that followed, the survivors faced the long work of aftermath and survival. Their bodies bore the weakening signs of hunger and exposure, skin stretched thin over bones, muscles wasted by cold and exhaustion. Yet the deepest wounds were those hidden from view. Memories of what had happened in the mountains followed them everywhere. For many, the winter lived on like shadows they could not step free from. Some survivors attempted to put their experiences into words. Their accounts gave later generations the closest look inside the ordeal itself. Still, the story quickly slipped into the hands of the press, where it became something else. Newspapers seized on the cannibalism angle. sometimes obscuring the accounts of mutual aid and the sacrifices of rescuers. Reports turned the Donner camps into a spectacle, and in doing so, reshaped how the public came to remember them. For the emigrants themselves, life had to be built again from almost nothing. They had lost wagons, tools, livestock, and most of their belongings. In California, neighbors and strangers gave what help they could: clothing, food, shelter. The Breens and Reeds received support that allowed them to settle and later grow within the communities that formed during the gold rush. But this practical generosity could not erase what had happened. The psychological weight of decisions made in hunger, of companions lost, lingered with them year after year. Mary Graves, who survived the Forlorn hope, once said she wished she could cry but could not. That her grief left her unable even for tears. Others carried themselves forward, yet spoke little of what they had endured. It was as if silence became its own shelter, a way of containing memories too great to share. The trauma did not vanish when they walked out of the mountains. It traveled with them into adulthood and old age. Their collective experience shaped more than individual lives. It altered how westward migration itself was remembered. Virginia Reed's quiet warning to avoid cutoffs settled into emigrant wisdom. Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can became more than her family's lesson. It became practical advice for anyone considering the road west. Travelers came to trust the long routes, the well-tested paths, rather than gamble on unproven shortcuts. Her words gave clear shape to the cost of ambition when it outran caution. The aftermath also shows how survival did not mean the same for everyone. Some survivors, like James Reed, managed to rise again, building security and influence in California. Others, like Louis Kesselberg, bore the burden of public suspicion and ostracism, his name forever tied to grim rumors. Their varied outcomes remind us not to fold the Donner experience into one story of triumph or tragedy. Some rebuilt lives. Others carried lasting scars that never eased. Even the landscape itself took on the memory. The passes and meadows where the emigrants struggled became place names in a wider frontier tale. Travelers later pointed them out as they moved through, reminders set into geography. In this way, the story took root in both memory and land. All of this created a lasting cultural echo. The Donner Party became not only a tragic warning, but also a lens through which people thought about risk, decision-making, and the limits of human ambition. That echo has grown more complex over time as historians and descendants continue to reconsider what truly happened in the cabins and along the trail. And now as we turn, we can ask, how do we know for certain what life in those camps was really like? Archaeology gives us another way of listening to the Donner Party. Instead of relying only on written accounts or memories recorded years later, we can look at what remained in the ground where they lived through that winter. Excavations at Alder Creek and Truckee Lake uncovered traces of daily life. Hearths where meals were prepared, fragments of ceramics, wagon hardware, and even decorated sherds from a teacup. These quiet objects let us see how families tried to organize shelter and preserve a semblance of order. Physical evidence also helps measure the conditions people faced. The tree stumps left a foot or more above the ground show how deep the snow was when wood had to be cut. Imagine the height of those stumps as a marker of labor done in drifts that reached chest high. Archaeologists also found fonal remains from cows, horses, dogs, and rabbits, many burned, fragmented, or bearing cut marks. This analysis confirms that families turned to every possible food source they could reach, processing animals not usually considered for meat. What archaeology has not found is just as striking. Despite persistent stories of cannibalism, researchers have recovered little or no definite human bone from these sites. DNA testing on many of the fragments proved inconclusive, but absence here does not equal disproof. Human bone may have gone unrecognized in early excavations, or it could have broken down in snow, acidic soil, or through fires used to cook. It is also possible that flesh and organs were consumed without leaving skeletal traces. Rather than contradicting the written accounts, this absence simply shows the limits of evidence and the difficulty of speaking with certainty about such private acts of survival. Visual note to editor. Here could be a calm archival photo of the tree stumps at the starvation campsite, captioned to show how high the snow reached. The archaeological record balances the written accounts by showing not just moments of desperation, but also the persistence of ordinary life. A small writing slate left behind carries doodles and notes, evidence that lessons continued even in the cold. These scraps reveal that children and adults tried to hold on to daily routines. In a winter defined by hunger, they still set aside time for reading, scribbling, and memory. Details like these remind us that survival was not only about food, but also about preserving identity and community. Other discoveries expand the story beyond the emigrants themselves. At Alder Creek, stone tools made by native peoples appeared among the ashes and bones. Their presence reminds us that this land already held long histories of habitation. These artifacts set the immigrants within a wider human landscape, where Washoe families lived, traveled, and tried to cope with the sudden arrival of strangers in crisis. Archaeology restores this larger context, showing that the immigrants were never entirely alone. So what does all of this mean? Archaeology does not erase the tragic narratives or the survivors' words. Instead, it adds layers, quieting exaggeration and sharpening the focus. It shows the daily mechanics of survival: what was eaten, how shelters were built, what children traced onto slates, as well as the silences where evidence cannot speak. And when we put these fragments together, what we find is not just loss but testimony of how people adapted in one of the harshest trials imaginable. Which brings us to another way of looking, not through objects in the soil, but through the people themselves, and what their choices reveal about the human mind under pressure. The Donner Party story also opens a window into the psychology of survival itself. Their ordeal shows how people respond when the ordinary rules of choice collapse under pressure, and survival becomes the only measure left. Human endurance can stretch far beyond what most of us imagine. The body adapts to scarcity, cold, and pain in ways that feel almost impossible until tested. Yet that endurance never comes without a price. Prolonged hunger, isolation, and fear rewired daily life into a cycle of conserving energy and guarding hope. What would you do when survival becomes the only logic left? Social bonds made that struggle bearable for some. Families who stayed together often managed to share food, divide labor, and steady each other through despair. Demographic studies reinforce this pattern. Men died at nearly twice the rate of women, and children and family groups fared better than those without close kin. Biology played its part. Men's higher metabolic needs and heavier labor loads left them more vulnerable once rations thinned. But family support and communal networks mattered just as much as physiology. Psychological strength did not come from endurance alone, but from meaning that could still be drawn from each day. The Breens kept a diary throughout their confinement, marking events and keeping track of weeks when the landscape erased all sense of time. Simple routines, even in hunger, gave a shape to life that helped resist despair. Hope itself proved a resource almost as critical as food. We see this most clearly in the Forlorn Hope Party, who pressed on into the snow not only out of desperation but also out of faith that help might still be found beyond the ridges. Moral choices pressed closer as suffering deepened. Acts of compassion, sharing a final scrap of food, stood side by side with moments of withdrawal when people guarded what little they had left. The decision to consume the flesh of the dead was not made lightly, but surfaced from conditions that forced survival above every other calculus. These choices are unsettling to revisit, but they reveal the tension between human compassion and human desperation. Out of that tension, the story shows, both solidarity and fracture emerged. The psychological toll endured long after the snow melted. Survivors carried traumas that reshaped belief and conviction. Some, like Virginia Reed, made vows in the midst of crisis that changed their spiritual lives forever. She promised that, if spared, she would embrace a deeper faith, and she kept that promise when she reached safety. Such decisions became ways to give meaning to suffering, anchors that offered peace where memory alone could overwhelm. Taken together, the Donner Party reminds us of the fragility and resilience within us all. Biology, family, faith, and willpower intersected under weight no person would ever willingly choose. Their experience asks us to reflect on what it means to endure, and how ordinary people meet extraordinary trials not as symbols but as human beings shaped by circumstance. So what does this matter now, so many years later? The patterns of resilience and failure in those mountain camps continue to echo because they speak to choices and ambitions that still shape lives today. Why does the Donner story still matter after so many years? Its legacy lies in how it continues to serve as both a caution and a reflection of ambition. The tale shows how ordinary people, relying on imperfect knowledge, could make choices that led to unimaginable consequences. It reminds us that aspiration often outpaces reality, and the cost of that gap can fall heavily on those least prepared for it. This history also illustrates the human cost hidden in the wider story of westward expansion. Families with names and voices paid dearly for the promise of California. Their ordeal stands as one chapter among many migrations marked by hardship, but its detail makes the lesson clear. Travelers who came after looked at these events and grew more careful in their preparation. They carried forward not just wagons and goods, but also a shared awareness of what could go wrong. One of the most direct lessons was simple. Untested shortcuts cost time and lives. The Hastings Cutoff, promoted so confidently, became a line few dared to follow again. Hastings' route fell into disuse after 1846 as emigrants favored established tracks. The safe, proven trail became the wiser choice, and the Donner ordeal was the story that reinforced this truth more than any guidebook could. Yet, For all its warnings, the story also contained a paradox. Virginia Reed urged her cousin, in a letter after the ordeal, to still come west, but with care to avoid cutoffs. Her words offered both warning and encouragement. Where she had endured one of the darkest winters imaginable, she still held to the promise of California. That dual message shaped how people thought about migration, pursue better lives, but with preparation and caution. Over time, the tale became as much about interpretation as about survival itself. Early press reports leaned heavily on the sensational, emphasizing cannibalism while downplaying mutual aid, family bonds, and the bravery of rescuers. Later scholarship, archaeology, and indigenous accounts broadened the view, reminding us that the Donner Camps were defined as much by cooperation as by tragedy. Each generation has found new meaning in the story, whether as a cautionary parable, a study of endurance, or a reflection on ambition's limits. The lasting wisdom is both practical and human. Preparation matters. Accurate information saves lives. Trusting untested claims can tip hope into catastrophe. At the same time, the Donner experience shows how people cling to meaning and support in the harshest conditions. In this way, the legacy is not only about mistakes made, but also about resilience shown. Virginia Reed's advice about avoiding shortcuts traveled far down the trail. It gave immigrants a rule to repeat, and perhaps to whisper to themselves when choices loomed. Those words may have saved countless lives by steering wagons toward proven routes and urging patience over speed. And they live on today as a reminder that choices are never just practical. They reach into who we are and what we hope for. The Donner Party remains in our memory because it speaks to caution, ambition, loss, and persistence at once. Its lessons touch the personal and the collective, showing how history is carried not by legends but by families making difficult decisions. From here, we can consider with quiet clarity how such stories guide the way we think about our own choices now. So what can we carry forward from this story? The Donner Party's experience stands as both a tragedy and a lesson about planning, preparation, and the strength of community under strain. Their journey reminds us how quickly ambition can turn perilous when shortcuts and untested promises replace steady paths. As you think on their ordeal, consider how their cautionary tale might inform the journeys you undertake. In moments when hope and risk collide, careful choices and shared support often matter most. If this felt restful and curious, subscribe for more stories like this.